Imagine a world where everything you know about the first Christians simply does not exist. The martyrs, the persecutions, the letters of the bishops, the councils, the debates that shaped the faith of billions of people, all of it erased. Because the truth is that almost everything that has reached us about the first 3 centuries of Christianity, every name, every date, every account of blood and faith, passed through the hands of a single man, a bishop, a historian, an advisor to emperors. His name was Eusebius, and the history he wrote was not merely a record of the past, it was the foundation upon which Christianity built its own memory. But here is what almost no one tells you. Eusebius was not a neutral observer. He had allies, he had enemies, he had an emperor at his side, and he had reasons to tell the story exactly the way he told it. The question no one asks is, what did he choose to leave out? To understand who Eusebius was, you must first understand the world into which he was born, because nothing he did makes sense outside of that setting. We are around the year AD 260. The Roman Empire is a colossus in crisis. Not just any crisis, an existential one. In the previous decades, the empire nearly collapsed. Emperors rose to power and were assassinated within months. The frontiers were attacked by Germanic tribes in the north, Persians in the east, and internal revolts erupted across the provinces. The economy was in ruins, the currency devalued, and the army, the only institution still holding the empire together, consumed resources Rome no longer possessed. And in the midst of this chaos, a religion was growing in silence. By this point, Christianity was no longer a marginal movement of Galilean fishermen. It had organized bishops, communication networks between cities, property, communal treasuries, and a structure that, in many places, functioned better than the imperial administration itself. This was unsettling, deeply unsettling. It is in this environment that Eusebius was born, probably in Caesarea Maritima, a port city on the coast of Palestine. This was no ordinary city. Caesarea was an intellectual, political, and commercial center. It had been built by Herod the Great as a monument to Roman power in the land of the Jews. It housed one of the greatest Christian libraries of the ancient world. The library founded by Origen and expanded by Pamphilus, Eusebius's mentor. And here is a detail that changes everything. Pamphilus was not merely a theologian. He was an obsessive collector of manuscripts. He devoted his life to gathering, copying, and preserving Christian, Jewish, and even pagan texts. Eusebius grew up inside that library, literally. The texts that would later form the backbone of his Historia Ecclesiastica were already there, within arm's reach, organized by a man who believed that preserving knowledge was an act of faith. Eusebius did not become the father of church history by accident. He was shaped for it, by a place, by a mentor, and by a collection that almost no one else in the Christian world had access to. But there was another factor, something that transformed Eusebius's intellectual urgency into a matter of survival. In the year 303, Emperor Diocletian launched the most brutal and systematic persecution Christians had ever faced. It was not like the previous waves, sporadic, regional, driven by local crises. This time, it was an imperial project. Edicts were issued ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred scriptures, the imprisonment of clergy, and the mandatory offering of sacrifices to the Roman gods. Those who refused were executed. Eusebius witnessed it. He saw companions imprisoned. He saw Pamphilus, his teacher, his spiritual father, incarcerated, and after 2 years in prison, executed. The accounts Eusebius left of this period are filled with restrained grief, with names he insists on recording one by one, as if refusing to allow the empire to erase those lives from memory. And it is precisely here that something ignites within him. Because when the world tries to destroy the history of a people, someone must write it before it is too late. Eusebius decided that someone would be him. What he did not yet know was that, within a few years, the empire itself would change sides, and he would stand at the very center of that transformation. To understand the magnitude of what Eusebius built, We need to go even further back in time, because the story he chose to tell did not begin with him. It began centuries earlier, in a movement the Roman Empire tried to ignore until it realized it was already too late. In the first 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Christianity spread in a way that defies any political or military model of expansion. It had no armies, no gold, no senate. It had fishermen, weavers, slaves, and merchants who carried a message along the commercial routes of the Mediterranean, the same routes that transported olive oil, grain, and silk. The gospel traveled inside merchant ships, in whispered conversations in the ports of Corinth, Ephesus, Alexandria, and Rome. It was a religion that moved through commerce, not through the sword. And this is fundamental, because when Roman historians finally decided to speak about Christians, they no longer knew how to explain how it had happened. Tacitus mentioned Christians in passing, while describing the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, treating them as a pernicious superstition. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia around AD 112, wrote to Emperor Trajan asking for guidance because he did not know what to do with those people who gathered before dawn to sing hymns to Christ as to a god. Suetonius mentioned disturbances in Rome caused by someone called Chrestus, probably a distorted reference to Christ. Notice this: the Romans recorded fragments, footnotes, incidental mentions. None of them cared to document Christianity as a historical phenomenon. To them, it was just another Eastern sect among many, and Eastern sects did not deserve imperial chronicles. This is the void Eusebius encountered when he decided to look backward. Christians themselves in the first centuries also lacked a historiographical tradition in the classical sense. They had apostolic letters, acts of martyrdom, apologies addressed to emperors, theological treatises. But no one had sat down to organize all of this into a sequential narrative. Irenaeus of Lyons, in the 2nd century, wrote against heresies. Tertullian, in North Africa, produced legal and polemical texts in defense of the faith. Clement of Alexandria and Origen advanced philosophical theology. But none of them did what Eusebius would do: weave all these fragments into a continuous history from the apostles to his own time. And here comes a detail that is almost never mentioned. The Library of Caesarea, the very one where Eusebius was trained, was not merely a collection of Christian texts. It was an ambitious intellectual project that went back to Origen, the greatest Christian scholar of the 3rd century. Origen had settled in Caesarea around AD 233, after being expelled from Alexandria due to conflicts with the local bishop. He brought with him an immense number of manuscripts, and more importantly, a method. Origen believed that sacred scripture should be studied with the same rigor Greek philosophers applied to Homer. He created the hexapla, a monumental edition of the Old Testament arranged in 6 parallel columns. The original Hebrew, a Greek transliteration, and 4 different Greek translations side by side. It was a work of textual criticism without parallel for more than 1,000 years. When Origen died, around AD 254, this collection remained in Caesarea, and it was Pamphilus who took upon himself the mission of preserving and expanding it. Pamphilus was a man of means, probably from an aristocratic family in Beirut, who abandoned a comfortable life to devote himself to copying and preserving manuscripts. He established a scriptorium, hired scribes, and transformed the Library of Caesarea into a true research center. It was there that copies of texts were kept that had already disappeared elsewhere: letters of 2nd century bishops, records of regional councils, and martyr accounts from remote provinces. Eusebius entered this world as a disciple of Pamphilus, and this was no ordinary relationship. Eusebius adopted the name Eusebius of Pamphilus in honor of his master, a gesture that, in the culture of the time, amounted to acknowledging spiritual fatherhood. Together, the two worked on a monumental defense of Origen's writings, which by then were already under theological attack. They wrote 5 volumes of this apology, while Pamphilus was imprisoned during the persecution of Diocletian. Eusebius went in and out of the prison, carrying manuscripts, consulting texts, drafting arguments. The 6th volume he completed alone, after Pamphilus was beheaded in AD 310. This moment marks a rupture in Eusebius's life. The death of his mentor was not merely a personal loss, it was a warning. If men like Pamphilus could be eliminated, if libraries could be burned, if imperial edicts could order the destruction of all Christian scriptures, then the entire memory of Christianity was at risk. This was not a theoretical possibility. It was happening at that very moment before his eyes. And there was more. The persecution of Diocletian did not strike Christianity uniformly. In the Latin West, where the co-emperor Constantius Chlorus ruled, enforcement of the edicts was mild, in some places almost non-existent. But in the East, where Diocletian and later Galerius held power, the violence was systematic. In Egypt, Christians were sent to the copper mines of the Sinai. In Palestine, Eusebius's own homeland, public executions multiplied. In Caesarea, he witnessed condemned Christians thrown to wild beasts in the arena. He recorded names, dates, methods of execution, not as a distant chronicler, but as a witness who knew that if he did not write these things down, no one else would. There is a disturbing detail scholars still debate today. During the persecution, there are indications that Eusebius himself was imprisoned for a time, but survived. How? We do not know for certain. Some historians suggest he may have made some formal concession, perhaps handing over copies of texts, perhaps performing a symbolic act of submission that allowed him to be released. Eusebius never addresses this directly, and that silence, for many, is as revealing as any confession. Because here is the question that hangs over all of Eusebius's work. He was both a witness and a survivor. And survivors, by definition, carry the tension of telling the story of those who did not survive, knowing that the way they tell that story is also a way of justifying their own survival. It was in this state, grieving, marked, surrounded by ruins and manuscripts, that Eusebius began to write his Historia Ecclesiastica, not as a calm academic project, but as an act of resistance against forgetting. He did not yet know, however, that the political landscape was about to change so radically that it would transform the persecuted into an advisor and the survivor into an architect of the new order. The year is AD 312, and the world is about to be turned upside down. On a dusty road leading to Rome, an ambitious general named Constantine was marching with his army to confront Maxentius, the man who controlled the imperial capital. It was a civil war like many the empire had seen in recent decades. Struggles for the throne, legion against legion, Roman blood spilled by Roman hands. Nothing new, except for one detail that would change the history of Western civilization forever. According to the account Eusebius himself would record years later, Constantine experienced a vision before the battle. He saw in the sky a cross of light with the words, "By this sign, conquer," in hoc signo vinces. He ordered the Christian symbol painted on his soldiers' shields, and he won. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Maxentius was defeated and drowned in the Tiber while trying to flee. Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed master of the West. Now stop and consider what this meant, not only for politics, but for a bishop in Caesarea, who only a few years earlier had seen his mentor beheaded by imperial order. The same empire that burned scriptures and executed Christians now had at its head a man who claimed to have conquered by the cross. It is hard to exaggerate the speed with which everything changed. In February of AD 313, Constantine and Licinius, the emperor of the East, issued what is known as the Edict of Milan. In practice, it was not exactly an edict, but a letter of instructions to provincial governors. Its content, however, was revolutionary. Religious freedom for all, restitution of confiscated Christian property, and the end of any official persecution. Overnight, Christians went from criminals to citizens protected by the throne. But Constantine did not stop there, and this is where the story becomes far more complex than the simplified version usually told. Constantine was not merely tolerant of Christianity, he was strategic. The empire was fractured. The old pagan religious structures no longer provided social cohesion. Traditional cults were fragmented, local, without centralized hierarchy. Christianity, on the other hand, had exactly what Rome needed: an episcopal structure organized by cities and provinces, a communication network covering the entire Mediterranean, a unifying doctrine, and internal discipline that functioned almost like a parallel administration. Constantine saw this and recognized an opportunity no previous emperor had grasped. He began financing church construction on a monumental scale. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, all were Constantinian projects. He granted tax exemptions to Christian clergy. He allowed bishops to serve as judges in civil disputes, the so-called Episcopalis Audientia, creating a parallel judicial system that gave Christian leaders powers previously reserved for Roman magistrates. He transferred wealth from pagan temples to new basilicas. Economically speaking, it was the largest redistribution of religious resources the ancient world had ever seen, and Eusebius watched all of this from Caesarea, not as a distant observer, but as someone being drawn into the very center of the storm, because Constantine had a problem armies could not solve and gold could not buy. Christians, now free, were dividing among themselves, and the division had a name: Arius. Arius was a presbyter in Alexandria, charismatic, popular, with impressive rhetorical skill. He taught that the Son of God, the Logos, Christ, was not eternal like the Father. He had been created by God before all things, the most exalted of creatures, but not of the same divine substance. For Arius, to say that the Son was equal to the Father was to confuse the Creator with the creature. The phrase that made him famous and infamous was simple and devastating: there was a time when the Son did not exist. On the other side, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria and his young deacon Athanasius argued that the Son was homoousios, of the same substance as the Father, co-eternal, co-equal, without beginning. To deny this, they believed, was to destroy the very foundation of Christian salvation. If Christ was not fully God, then redemption was incomplete. The debate spread like wildfire. It did not remain confined to Alexandria. Bishops across the East took sides. Letters circulated. Regional synods were convened. Ordinary people, yes, ordinary people, debated in the streets, markets, and public baths. The historian Gregory of Nyssa would later remark that in Constantinople it was impossible to buy bread without the baker expressing an opinion on whether the Son was begotten or created. Constantine was furious. Not over theology. There is evidence that at first he did not even grasp the depth of the dispute. He was furious because the division threatened exactly what he wanted from Christianity: unity. One empire, one emperor, one God, one faith. To Constantine, the Arian controversy was an administrative problem clothed in theological language. And so, in AD 325, he convened what would become the first ecumenical council in Christian history, the Council of Nicaea. 318 bishops, according to tradition, though the exact number is debated, gathered in the city of Nicaea in Bithynia at the emperor's invitation. Constantine paid for their travel, provided lodging, and hosted imperial banquets. Bishops who, only a few years earlier, bore marks of torture on their bodies, severed fingers, gouged eyes from the persecution of Diocletian, now sat in gilded halls beside an emperor who treated them as advisors. The contrast was surreal. Eusebius was there, and not as just another bishop. He occupied a position of prominence. According to his own account, he sat to the right of the emperor and delivered the opening address of praise to Constantine. Some modern historians suggest this position was not merely ceremonial, it was political. At that moment, Eusebius represented a middle way. He was not radically Arian, but neither was he as forceful as Athanasius in defending homoousios. He proposed a statement of faith based on the baptismal creed of Caesarea, more traditional, less philosophically charged. But the council, under pressure from the faction of Alexander and Athanasius, and from Constantine himself, who wanted a definitive solution, adopted the term homoousios. The Nicene Creed was born, using language Eusebius publicly accepted, but which, in later letters to his community in Caesarea, he felt compelled to explain and justify with evident discomfort. This episode reveals something essential about Eusebius. He was not a man of theological trenches. He was a mediator, an intellectual who preferred synthesis over confrontation, and above all, someone who understood power and knew how to position himself near it without being consumed. After Nicaea, the relationship between Eusebius and Constantine deepened. The emperor consulted him, requested copies of manuscripts. He commissioned Eusebius to produce no fewer than 50 copies of the Christian Bible for the new churches of Constantinople, an order some scholars believe may be connected to the ancestors of surviving great codices, such as the Codex Vaticanus or the Codex Sinaiticus, though this connection remains debated. It is during this period, between Nicaea and Constantine's death in AD 337, that Eusebius produces most of his monumental work. The Historia Ecclesiastica receives its final revisions, incorporating the triumphant narrative of Constantine's victory as the climax of Christian history. The life of Constantine is conceived as a biography that presents the emperor almost as a new Moses, a divinely chosen liberator leading God's people from bondage to freedom. The Praeparatio Evangelica and the Demonstratio Evangelica argue that all previous history, Greek philosophy, Jewish prophecy, even the structure of the Roman Empire itself, was a divine preparation for the advent of Christ and the triumph of the Church. Notice what is happening. Eusebius is not merely recording events, he is constructing a theological narrative of history, a narrative in which everything converges toward a purpose, in which persecution was a trial, survival was proof of divine election, and alliance with the empire was prophetic fulfillment. Every page he writes reinforces one central idea. Human history is, at its core, the story of God's providence guiding the Church toward its destiny. This vision would be extraordinarily influential. For more than 1,000 years, the way the Christian West understood the relationship between church and state, between faith and power, between sacred history and secular history, was shaped, directly or indirectly, by the framework Eusebius created. But every construction has cracks, and the cracks in Eusebius's work would not take long to appear, even if it took centuries for them to be fully recognized. And this is where the story of Eusebius stops being merely fascinating and becomes uncomfortable, because there is a difference between a historian and a propagandist. And the line between the two in Eusebius's work is so thin that even the greatest specialists in patristics disagree about where it truly lies. Let us begin with what is undeniable. The Historia Ecclesiastica is, by any standard, a monumental achievement. 10 books covering everything from the Church's founding by the Apostles to Constantine's victory. Eusebius quotes entire documents, letters of bishops, imperial rescripts, acts of martyrdom, fragments of authors who, without him, would have vanished forever. Papias of Hierapolis, Hegesippus, Julius Africanus. We know these names because Eusebius preserved them. He functions as a kind of anchor. Almost every chain of textual transmission about early Christianity, at some point, runs through him. But it is precisely this near monopoly that raises the hardest questions. First, selection. Eusebius decided what to include and what to omit. That is inevitable in any historiographical work. No one can record everything. But in Eusebius's case, the omissions form a pattern. He virtually ignores Western Christianity. Rome appears, yes, but only superficially. The churches of Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa receive minimal mention. The focus is overwhelmingly Eastern: Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor. That does not mean Eusebius was dishonest. It means his vision was bounded by his own geographic horizon and by the sources available in Caesarea. But the result is that the Historia Ecclesiastica presents a version of early Christianity centered on the world Eusebius knew, and that version was accepted as the complete story for centuries. Second, theological framing. Eusebius did not write like a modern academic trying to separate fact from interpretation. For him, history was theology in motion. Every persecution was a divine test. Every heresy was a demonic assault. Every persecuting emperor was an instrument of evil. And Constantine, naturally, was the instrument of providence. This means events are presented within a framework that does not always match the complexity of what actually happened. Emperors like Gallienus, who granted periods of tolerance to Christians decades before Constantine, receive little attention. The narrative needed a climax, and the climax was Constantine. Third, and this is perhaps the most delicate point, the Arian question. Eusebius signed the Nicene Creed, yes, but his personal theology was closer to a moderate subordinationist position, meaning he viewed the Son as divine, but not identical with the Father in substance, in the way more hardline Nicenes argued. After the council, Eusebius never directly attacked Arius in his writings, and in the years after Nicaea, when the political tide turned and Nicene bishops like Athanasius began to be exiled, Eusebius participated in synods that condemned them. In 335, at the Synod of Tyre, Eusebius was among the bishops who voted for Athanasius's deposition, the same Athanasius who, decades later, would be venerated as the great defender of orthodoxy. That does not make Eusebius a villain. It makes him a man of his time, navigating between theological convictions and political pressure. But it raises an unavoidable question. If the man who wrote the Church's official history held theological sympathies that would later be considered heterodox, to what extent was his version of the past shaped by those sympathies? And there is more. The Life of Constantine, the biography Eusebius wrote after the emperor's death in 337, is a text that oscillates between biography and panegyric. Constantine is portrayed as pious from youth, guided by divine visions, incapable of genuine wickedness. Eusebius omits or minimizes deeply disturbing episodes from the emperor's life. The execution of his own son, Crispus, in 326, for reasons that remain obscure, possibly an accusation of conspiracy or adultery with Empress Fausta. The death of Fausta shortly afterward, apparently suffocated in an overheated bath on Constantine's orders. These events, which other ancient historians, such as Zosimus and the anonymous author of the Epitome de Caesaribus, recorded without hesitation, simply do not appear in Eusebius's version. Silence. Where there should be horror, there is silence. And that silence has consequences. Because the image of Constantine that dominated Christian tradition for more than 1,000 years, the saintly emperor equal to the apostles, as the Orthodox Church venerates him to this day, was, in large part, constructed by Eusebius. The version he chose to tell became the canonical version, and the voices that told a different story were marginalized, lost, or dismissed as pagan and hostile. Here is the central paradox of Eusebius's work. He preserved the memory of early Christianity like no one before him. But in doing so, he also filtered it. Every choice to include was simultaneously a choice to exclude. Every paragraph illuminated one fragment of the past while leaving another in shadow. And what is most unsettling is that we have no way of knowing for certain what remained in that shadow. The texts Eusebius did not quote, the accounts he did not copy, the traditions he did not consider worthy of record, many of these simply disappeared. The library of Caesarea, that treasure house that fed his entire project, did not survive late antiquity. It was destroyed, probably during the Persian invasions of the 7th century, or perhaps earlier, in one of the earthquakes that periodically devastated the Palestinian coast. Along with it, vanished manuscripts that might have told a different story. What remains is the history Eusebius chose to tell, and the uncomfortable awareness that, however valuable that history is, it is still only a version, written by a man with allies, enemies, fears, and ambitions, at the very moment the relationship between faith and power was being reinvented in an irreversible way. The question modern historians ask is not whether Eusebius lied. Most agree he did not fabricate documents or invent events. The question is subtler and more disturbing. What does it mean when the history of an entire religion depends on the curatorship of a single individual? And what is lost when the curator is also an interested party? These questions could not be asked as long as Eusebius was the only available source. But once modern historical criticism began to confront his work with other evidence, papyri discovered in Egypt, inscriptions unearthed in Asia Minor, Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi, the cracks became impossible to ignore. And what those cracks revealed did not diminish Eusebius, but it showed that the story of early Christianity was far more plural, far more conflicted, and far more human than the elegant, providential narrative he constructed. Eusebius died around AD 339. He was about 80 years old, an extraordinary age for the time. He died as Bishop of Caesarea, respected, influential, surrounded by books and disciples. He did not die a martyr. He did not die in exile. He died in his bed, in his city, in his library. And that, by itself, already says a great deal about the world he helped to build. But the true consequence of his work was not measured in the years immediately after his death. It was measured in centuries. The first consequence was methodological. Eusebius invented a genre. Before him, no one had written a history of the Church. After him, every ecclesiastical historian followed the model he created. Socrates Scholasticus, Sodzomen, and Theodoret of Cyrus, the three great church historians of the 5th century, wrote explicitly as Eusebius's continuators. They began where he stopped. They adopted the same structure, a chronological narrative organized by imperial reigns and episcopal successions. They used the same categories: orthodoxy versus heresy, persecution versus triumph, divine providence as the engine of history. None of them questioned the fundamental framework. They simply inherited it, and it was not only Greek historians. In the Latin West, when Rufinus of Aquileia translated the Historia Ecclesiastica into Latin at the beginning of the 5th century, he did not merely translate. He added 2 books covering the period after Eusebius. That Latin translation became the standard text on church history throughout medieval Europe. Monks in monasteries in Ireland, England, France, and Italy copied and recopied Rufinus for centuries. Eusebius's version, filtered through Rufinus, was literally the only window the medieval West had into the first centuries of Christianity. Think about the weight of that. For more than 1,000 years, every priest, every bishop, every theologian, every Christian king who wanted to understand the origins of the faith had to pass through Eusebius. There was no alternative, no second opinion. The institutional memory of Christianity was, for all practical purposes, the memory Eusebius constructed. The second consequence was political, and perhaps deeper than the methodological one. Eusebius's political theology, that vision of the Roman Empire as an instrument of divine providence and the Christian emperor as God's representative on earth, became the dominant model of church-state relations in the Christian East. In Byzantium, the emperor was called Isapostolos, equal to the apostles. He presided over councils, appointed patriarchs, legislated on doctrine. This fusion of imperial authority and religious authority, which Eusebius celebrated in his Life of Constantine, remained the organizing principle of the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In the West, the story was different, but the starting point was the same. When the Western Roman Empire disintegrated in the 5th century, the Latin Church had to reinvent the relationship between spiritual power and temporal power. Augustine of Hippo, writing The City of God after the sack of Rome in 410, proposed a more radical separation between the earthly city and the heavenly city, a response, in some measure, to Eusebius's providential optimism. But even Augustine did not fully escape the shadow of the Bishop of Caesarea. The idea that history has meaning, that it moves in a direction, that political events can be read as signs of a larger plan, that narrative structure is Eusebian at its root. And here is something that is rarely acknowledged. The very notion of the history of Christian civilization, the idea that there is a continuous line from Jesus to the apostles, from the apostles to the martyrs, from the martyrs to Constantine, from Constantine to Christian Europe, is a construction, a powerful and influential construction, in many respects true, but still a construction. And its chief architect was Eusebius. The third consequence, and perhaps the most invisible, concerned what was left out. Because when a narrative becomes canonical, everything that does not fit inside it tends to disappear, and much of it did. Early Christianity was extraordinarily diverse. There were Gnostic communities in Egypt, reading Gospels that never entered the canon, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. There were Judaizing Christians in Palestine, who maintained circumcision and dietary laws. There were Encretite groups in Syria, who rejected marriage and practiced radical asceticism. There were Montanists in Phrygia, who believed in new prophecies and had women as leaders. There were Marcionites who rejected the Old Testament entirely and worshipped a different God from the God of Israel. Eusebius knew these groups. He mentions many of them in his Historia Ecclesiastica, but always as deviations, as errors, as demonic assaults on the true faith. His narrative had no room for the idea that early Christianity was, in fact, a contested field in which multiple versions competed for legitimacy. In Eusebius's version, orthodoxy was original and heresy was derivative. Truth came first, error came later. That thesis, which the German historian Walter Bauer challenged head-on in his 1934 book, Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, dominated Christian historiography for 16 centuries, and its foundation was Eusebius. When the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were discovered in Egypt in 1945, an entire collection of Gnostic texts buried in a ceramic jar around the 4th century, the academic world grasped, for the first time, the depth of what had been lost. There were voices Eusebius had mentioned only to refute, entire theologies he had reduced to paragraphs of condemnation, traditions that, for 1600 years, were known only through the version preserved by their opponents, and the papyri did not stop appearing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves of Qumran, were not Christian, they were Jewish. But they revealed a pre-Christian religious world far more complex than Eusebius or any ancient author had described. Apocalyptic sects, diverse messianic expectations, desert communities in Judea with rigorous rules and cosmic visions that intersected with the origins of the Christian movement in ways Eusebius never addressed. Every archaeological discovery, every unearthed papyrus, every deciphered inscription made the picture richer, and at the same time more distant from the clean, providential narrative Eusebius constructed, not because he lied, but because reality was larger than any single narrative could contain. And the tragedy is that, for most of Christian history, his narrative was treated not as one version among other possibilities, but as the version. The consequences echo to this day. The way Christian denominations relate to their own history, debates over the biblical canon, disputes over ecclesiastical authority, controversies about the relationship between church and state, all of it carries, in deeper layers, the legacy of choices a bishop in Caesarea made in the 4th century. Eusebius could not have foreseen any of this. He wrote with the tools he had, in the world he knew, to address problems that were urgent in his time. But what he created far exceeded what he imagined, and the consequences, both luminous and dark, are an inseparable part of the history of Christianity.
And here we are,
more than 1700 years later, and Eusebius of Caesarea is still with us. even though most people have never heard his name. When you open a study Bible and read a footnote that mentions the early church fathers, the chain of transmission behind that knowledge runs through Eusebius. When a pastor steps into the pulpit and tells the story of Christian martyrs facing lions in Roman arenas, the earliest and most detailed source for those accounts is the Historia Ecclesiastica. When a documentary on YouTube or on television or on any platform reconstructs the first centuries of Christianity, its script rests, directly or indirectly, on the framework Eusebius established. He is everywhere, invisible but structural. And this raises questions that are deeply relevant to our time. We live in an era in which we constantly debate who controls narratives, who decides what enters history books, who has the power to define what is the official version and what is an alternative theory, who chooses which voices are amplified and which are silenced. These questions, which feel so modern, so connected to the digital age and contemporary politics, are precisely the same questions that the work of Eusebius forces us to ask about the past. Because Eusebius did not have the internet, he did not have algorithms, he did not have social media, but he possessed something just as powerful, a monopoly on memory. He was the man with access to the greatest Christian library of the ancient world, with the protection of the most powerful emperor on earth, and with the intellectual ability to transform scattered fragments into a coherent narrative. In an age when information traveled through hand-copied manuscripts and most of the population was illiterate, controlling the narrative meant controlling reality. And he did so masterfully. Not out of malice, by all indications, Eusebius genuinely believed what he wrote. He believed that divine providence guided history. He believed that Constantine was an instrument of God. He believed that Nicene orthodoxy, even if he personally had reservations about certain terms, was the right path toward unity in the Church. His choices were not cynical. They were convictions. And perhaps that is what made them even more powerful, because the most effective propaganda is the kind its author sincerely believes to be true. Today, the Academy treats Eusebius with a mixture of reverence and caution. Reverence, because without him, we would face a catastrophic gap in our knowledge of early Christianity. Caution, because we know his work is both source and filter. Historians such as Bart Ehrman, Peter Brown, Timothy Barnes, and Averell Cameron have devoted entire careers to dismantling, contextualizing, and reconstructing the Eusebian narrative, not to destroy it, but to understand its layers. And for Christians, the issue is even more personal, because recognizing that the history of one's faith was mediated by a man with limitations, interests, and blind spots does not diminish faith, but it does demand a different kind of maturity. It requires accepting that spiritual truth and historical truth do not always present themselves in the same way, that the hand of God can act through imperfect instruments, that preserving memory is a sacred act, but that every preserved memory is also an edited memory. Eusebius of Caesarea was neither a flawless hero nor a calculating manipulator. He was something more complex and more human than either label allows. He was a survivor who decided that the history of his people deserved to be told, an intellectual who believed that divine providence had a plan, and that this plan included him, a man who lived at the exact intersection of faith, power, and memory, and who used the tools available to him to build something that endured for millennia. What he built is not perfect, but it is indispensable. And perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer Eusebius, after everything we now know about his choices and his silences, is neither to accept him blindly nor to dismiss him lightly. It is to read him with open eyes, with gratitude for what he preserved, and with the courage to ask what he left out. If a single man was responsible for preserving almost everything we know about the first 3 centuries of Christianity, and at the same time had the power to decide what would be left out, do you trust the history that has reached us? Or do you believe there are still buried truths waiting to be discovered? Reflect, comment, share.